The Prodigal Son. In a peaceful valley, where olive groves stretched toward distant hills and vineyards traced gentle patterns across the slopes, there lived a father with his two sons. Their home was a place of abundance and harmony, where the rhythms of daily life flowed like a gentle stream through the changing seasons. The father was known throughout the region for his wisdom and kindness, managing his estate with both skill and compassion. The younger son grew restless, as young hearts often do, dreaming of distant horizons and adventures beyond the familiar boundaries of home. His thoughts wandered far from the olive groves and sheep pastures that had cradled his childhood. The comfort of home began to feel like constraints, and the predictable patterns of daily life seemed to him a cage rather than a blessing. One morning, as dawn painted the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, the younger son approached his father with a request that would change everything. He asked for his share of the inheritance, a portion of his father's estate that would typically only be given after death. His words hung in the morning air like heavy dew, their weight felt by all who heard them. The father's heart understood more than his son realized. He recognized in his child's restlessness the eternal dance between roots and wings, between the safety of home and the call of the unknown. Without judgment or reproach, he divided his property between his two sons. His eyes held only love as he watched his younger son prepare to leave, gathering his newfound wealth and making plans for departure. The days that followed were filled with quiet preparation. The younger son converted his inheritance into money, each transaction taking him one step further from the life he had known. His older brother watched in silence, continuing his daily work in the fields, his thoughts kept carefully hidden behind a mask of dignity and duty. At last came the morning of departure. The air was fresh with dawn's promise as the younger son shouldered his traveler's pack, now heavy with coins and dreams. His father stood in the doorway of their home, his silhouette framed by early morning light, offering a blessing that would follow his son into whatever distant lands awaited. The young man journeyed to a distant land, where everything felt new and exciting. The sights, sounds, and scents were intoxicatingly different from the familiar comfort of home. Markets bustled with exotic goods. Streets hummed with the voices of strangers speaking unfamiliar languages, and each day brought fresh discoveries that seemed to validate his choice to leave. At first, his wealth opened doors to experiences he had only dreamed of. He found himself welcomed into circles of new friends, invited to lavish feasts, and surrounded by those who celebrated his generous spirit. The coins in his purse seemed to promise endless possibilities, and he spent freely, believing that such abundance could never run dry. But as gentle summer days gave way to autumn, and autumn yielded to winter, things began to change. Like water slowly seeping through stone, his resources gradually diminished. The friends who had flocked to his side during times of plenty began to drift away like leaves on an autumn breeze. Their absence left a hollow echo in the spaces where laughter had once filled his days. Then came a time of famine in that distant land. The earth grew hard and unforgiving, and food became scarce. The young man, who had never known true want, found himself facing an empty purse and growling stomach. The weight of his choices settled upon his shoulders like a heavy cloak as he searched for work among people who had once welcomed him as an honored guest. Eventually, he found himself tending pigs for a local farmer, a task that would have been unthinkable in his father's house. The days grew long and lonely as he watched the animals feed, his own hunger gnawing at him until even the pods that sustained the pigs began to look appealing. No one offered him anything, and the memories of home began to haunt his dreams. In those quiet moments of desperation, as he sat among the pigs with the setting sun painting the sky in shades of memory, something began to stir in his heart. Like a seed long dormant suddenly reaching toward the light, understanding began to grow within him. He thought of his father's servants, who had plenty of bread while he was perishing with hunger. In the soft light of dawn, the young man rose from his place among the pigs, his heart having made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He would return home, not demanding restoration as a son, but hoping merely to serve as one of his father's hired workers. The journey home began with humble steps, each one carrying him closer to the place and people he had left behind. As he walked, he rehearsed the words he would say to his father. The phrase echoed in his mind like a gentle prayer. I have sinned against heaven, and before you, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. The road seemed both longer and shorter than he remembered, familiar landmarks appearing like old friends welcoming him back. Meanwhile, at home, his father had never stopped watching the road. Each day, as the sun traced its path across the sky, his eyes would drift to the horizon, hoping to see a familiar figure approaching. His love had never dimmed, his heart had never hardened, even as seasons changed and years passed. Then one afternoon, as the golden light of sunset softened the landscape, the father saw a distant figure on the road. Though his son was still far off, something in his heart recognized the weary traveler's walk. Before anyone else could react, the father was running, his robes gathered up, his dignity forgotten in the rush of love that carried him forward. The son began his carefully prepared speech, his voice thick with emotion, but before he could finish, his father's arms were around him. The embrace spoke of love that had never wavered, of forgiveness that had been waiting like spring beneath winter frost. The father's tears fell warm against his son's dusty cheek as years of separation dissolved in the miracle of reunion. With joy overflowing, the father called to his servants. His instructions came in a gentle cascade of love made visible. Bring the best robe, he said softly, and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. These weren't just gifts, but symbols of restoration, of a son's place reclaimed, of wholeness restored. The father called for the fatted calf to be prepared, and soon the sounds of celebration filled the evening air. Music drifted through the courtyard, mixing with the happy voices of those who had gathered to welcome the lost son home. The aroma of roasting meat and fresh bread wafted on the breeze, and lamps were lit as dusk settled over the joyful scene. The older son was returning from his work in the fields when he heard the unexpected sounds of music and dancing. The familiar path home carried unfamiliar celebrations to his ears, and he paused, wondering what could have prompted such festivities. A servant approached and gently explained that his brother had returned, and their father had welcomed him with open arms and a feast of celebration. Instead of joining the celebration, the older son remained outside, his heart heavy with complex emotions. Years of faithful service and duty seemed to weigh upon him like shadows at sunset. The father, noticing his absence, stepped away from the festivities to find his firstborn, his heart large enough to hold love for both sons. When the father found him, the older son spoke of his years of service, of commands never disobeyed, of celebrations he had never received. His words carried the echo of one who had stayed, who had carried responsibilities while his brother chased dreams in distant lands. The father listened with patience and understanding, his presence gentle and steady in the growing darkness. "My son," the father said softly, "you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours." His voice carried no reproach, only tender recognition of his older son's faithfulness. "It was right to celebrate and be glad. For this your brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." The words hung in the evening air like stars appearing in the twilight sky. In this moment, under the vast canvas of stars, the Father's love illuminated a truth as old as time itself. His heart was large enough to celebrate the return of the lost, while treasuring the presence of the one who had stayed. Like the home that had always kept a light burning in the window, his love remained constant for both his children. Perhaps we see ourselves in the younger son, having wandered far from where we ought to be, carrying the weight of choices we wish we could unmake. This story whispers hope to us, assuring us that the path home remains open, that love waits with open arms, ready to restore and celebrate our return.